Well, South Africa's longest and costliest strike has finally come to an end, with miners expected to report for duty tomorrow. This is Tonight. I am Bruce Whitfield. Tonight, live, we look beyond the 24 billion rand the platinum producers lost in revenue to find out where we are headed. Joining me this evening, Stanlib's mining analyst, Kobus Nell, and Eunomix business political risk analyst, Jessica van Onselen. Let's go to you first, Kobus, this evening, because it is finally over. It is finally the end of the most expensive strike that South Africa's ever seen. Who's won? Who's lost? And is there really a positive outcome to any of this?
Yeah, certainly no winners here, Bruce. I think almost every single stakeholder has sort of lost. Certainly from a country's perspective, I think the impact could be close to 1% on a cumulative effect on our GDP this year. From a pure revenue loss in terms of exports, from the company's perspective, a number of 30 billion rand is very material. And certainly, I think in confidence, I don't think we understand fully yet what knock this has given to confidence. The users of our product ultimately, what will they think this evening?
Does that matter in terms of the users of our product? We produce 80% of the world's platinum. It doesn't really matter what our consumers think, as long as we can supply it on a sustainable basis. And that's really the confidence you talk about.
Yeah, but unfortunately, we've already seen how platinum and rhodium in many cases has been substituted with palladium. And one got to understand, we're 1/3 of global palladium supply, Russia the other third, and Northern America the other third. So certainly from that perspective, you are really giving a lot of people incentives to try and diversify away from this concentration risk within platinum and rhodium. And that's really where we got the edge, and we should be making the most of it as a country.
And Jessica, from a political risk point of view, people look at some of our legislation, they look at some of the rules and regulations that we've put up in recent months. We've got bits of legislation being referred back to Parliament. The Mines Minister himself has referred contentious legislation back to Parliament as well. We've got a situation where South Africa finds itself under enormous economic pressure. From a political perspective, are there any winners?
It is difficult to look at the situation and say that there are any winners. There's no doubt that the landscape seems to be getting more complex by the day. It's difficult to sort of understand where Labour, it's sometimes difficult to understand where Labour is, where the sort of political parties are, where capital is, but it certainly seems that it's difficult for all these parties to sort of find a meeting of minds, to find spaces that they agree on. And I agree about your earlier point that the mineral legislative space seems to be becoming, quite contested and quite conflict-filled, with the MPRDA not being signed into law yet. And,
Neither of you is prepared to say that this is either a victory for business or for the union. So let me put words in your mouth and say Joseph Mutunjwa claims that this is a victory for the workers, this is a victory for workers' rights, this is a fundamental shift in the way in which labour relations are going to be conducted. That, if it sticks, changes surely our political landscape and ultimately onto the economic and business landscape as well, Jessica.
Look, I think there can be no doubt that the labour relations landscape in South Africa has changed irrevocably. The strike was an absolute watershed moment. I think it signalled a new type of sort of rise in the labour movement. And also a hardening and a sort of radicalization on both the sides of the union, because we see a lot of coverage on how radical the union in this case was, but I think also sort of hardening and more radical line from the producers, very clear about what they are and are not willing to negotiate on, very clear on their sort of, their own boundaries, and we're just not going beyond that line. And that's interesting to sort of get to those extreme points, but I think also concerning because it makes a social compact more difficult.
3 or 4 months ago, Kobus, I spoke to Mark Foundi, the chief executive of Anglo American, the majority shareholder in Anglo Platinum. He said this far and no further. But they have compromised, have they not, over the last couple of months?
I guess when one looks sort of at the numbers, the detail in the numbers that came out today, you effectively look at the entry-level salary, let's call it early 11% compounded annual growth rate for over the next 3 years. And when you sort of compare it back to the original offer that the producers have done, it certainly looks like it's very close to that. So I don't think there was a lot of compromising from the producers' perspective. I think they've been very clear from the beginning what they can afford, and they've stuck to that.
Okay, so they've been true to their principles. It then suggests that AMCU has bent over backwards now to get workers back to work, and perhaps at least 4 of the last 5 months have been wasted.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you do the mathematical calcs, and did the winners, did the workers actually, came out as the winners in this whole argument, then it sort of will take them roughly 20 years, I think, to try and make up the 6 months loss in effective salaries that they've incurred, let alone the damage that's been done, from an indebted perspective. Let alone the damage being done from employers' view on future production, potential layoffs. So it's very difficult to try and really say there was they were the clear standout here.
Jessica, there was an 11th hour attempt by AMCU to say, oh, and by the way, we've also agreed that there won't be any layoffs, to which the management teams went, no, that wasn't part of the agreement. It's not written down anywhere, and certainly we're not agreeing to that. That threat of potential layoffs and likely layoffs, I'm interested in Kobus's view as to how big this platinum sector is 5 years from now. That is really probably the biggest shift in the labour relations environment that we're going to see for the next 5 years in terms of what the labour volumes that the industry can afford to keep on.
Absolutely. I think we've known that South Africa as a country, the mining industry has to move from the low-wage sort of labour model. I think this is definitely going to trigger it. We've had CEOs signalling, Mark Cudefani mentioned as early as December, that the move towards mechanisation in the platinum sector will have to be accelerated, and people will really need to apply their minds to it. And I think that major restructuring of the platinum companies unfortunately seems inevitable.
Is it inevitable, Kobus?
I think at this stage, yes. And it's not just instability from a labour perspective. I think it's also given the changes in demand from the end product perspective, as well as from a recycling side. The secondary supply side that has increased a lot more focus on a global perspective to do a lot more on recycling side. And effectively, that's one of your biggest competitors for the primary producers. When you invest a lot of capital, billions of rand like these producers are doing, and you've got unstable labour environment, which makes out 50% of your cash operating costs. From a risk-reward perspective, it really is not a clear answer that sort of gives you.
The fights we're going to have for the next umpteen years will be, but the CEO earns this much, the unskilled worker earns this much. That is unfair. Therefore, every 3 years, we're going to go through this process all over again. Is there any way to avoid that?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I certainly, you're getting a sense that there will be more focus, I think, on the labour law side. I think we've seen some signals of that I think the
government's prepared to look at the Labour Relations Act and make some alterations. Yeah.
Yes, and the freedom at which you can go out on strike for unlimited periods of time without any rational way of concluding, matters is perhaps going to receive some attention, I would argue.
Jessica, how does the politics of this work? Because here you've got the tripartite alliance, which the last time I checked was made up of a very powerful trade union movement in the form of COSATU, the South African Communist Party, which is kind of left of centre, and the ANC, which is pretty pro-Labour in its origins and in the way in which it operates. It now has to tighten the screws on the Labour movement in an effort to control AMCU, but that's going to have some opposition from COSATU within its own rank, surely.
Well, absolutely, and it raises some serious ethical questions about why, the Labour Relations Act, the majoritarian principle, these kind of things are being revisited with sudden enthusiasm now that we've seen breakaway and independent unions, whereas they were never really tackled with much gusto when they were firmly inside the tripartite alliance. And I think unions such as AMCU and other breakaway unions have some genuine questions to ask about why now is the time to revisit strike.
It doesn't matter what the questions are. The ANC has sufficient power within the National Assembly to push through legislative change, and it will do so because it knows the country can't be held to ransom in the way it has been. You might not like it, but that's probably the way of the world. I mean, that's what it looks like, Kobus.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's
something you'd support, I guess, as well, because you would like to see swift and speedy ends to labour actions. Yeah. The trade union movement, though, will have a different view.
Ultimately, Bruce, in any of these arguments, you want to try and increase the size of the pie. The old argument of saying, how can we get more for everyone? Now, it may sound like a theoretical question that you can put on the table, but in reality, that is the case. Different stakeholders want different things. You need a referee in the middle that can actually orchestrate that. Ultimately, equity holders or the providers of capital sort of stands last in the queue, unfortunately. And it is a concern, because if there's no funders left in the end of the day, how can you actually develop these resources and actually get the most for the country and its people.
One number I've seen is that the labour force in the mining sector will be half of what it is now. Currently 500,000 odd people are employed in the mining sector. Could we see it as low as 250,000 in 5 years' time as a direct consequence of what has played out over the last 5 months?
I think, what we've sort of seen is when the gold sector was sort of winding down in terms of production, a lot of those employees or workers actually moved over to the platinum sector earlier 2000s, and that was a time when the platinum sector expanded. Now it's clear that the footprint, I think, is just too big, it's too lumpy. They got to tidy things up and actually increase the quality of operations so that they are in a position to maybe look better after workers. So certainly I think the unintended consequence of that will likely be less jobs for this country.
So fewer jobs for the country. What's the political consequence, Jessica?
Well, the political consequence is, of course, a shrinking union base. More unemployed people, the unions just have less people to kind of mobilize. The social ramifications will be enormous, both on the rural economies from where these migrant workers often come. And that creates political complexity for the ANC. I think this is going to become more challenging to kind of manage a large, skilled workers who are now find themselves unemployed, and also, increasing rural base of disenchanted former workers.
And we then look towards what's happened in Parliament in the last couple of weeks, the emergence of the EFF as a very vocal critic of the mainstream politics of South Africa, and there is more strength to the arm of the EFF and Julius Malema. This becomes a double-edged sword for the ANC.
Absolutely, and we've seen that Julius Malema has done his very best to align with AMCU, to be present in Marikana, making donations to the strike fund. He's certainly a shrewd operator in the sense of sort of noticing that there is discontent there, and I would not be surprised if we see a lot more of the EFF present and vocal in these union sort of, disagreements.
It's been a fascinating discussion. My thanks to both of my guests this evening. Stanlib's mining analyst, Kobus Nell, and Eunomix business political risk analyst, Jessica van Onselen this evening, unpacking the consequences of 5 months of strike action. Signed, sealed and delivered, however, today, a settlement that from tomorrow will see workers head back to the workspace, but it will be several months before platinum production is up to previous levels once again. Thank you for watching. There'll be more tonight, tomorrow. Till then, bye-bye.